You're listening to the VSL Aviation Podcast. I'm your host, Seth Lake. Whether you're listening on your favorite podcast platform or watching on YouTube or Twitch now, we're also on Instagram Live. It's very exciting. I appreciate you joining us. This is our weekly installment where I talk about some of the aviation questions that have been brought up in our Discord channel or through email. Most of these questions are coming in those formats, but I'll take them through Instagram or Facebook, however you find us. Shoot us a message about what questions you have specifically related to aviation stuff. And we tend to stick to, check ride stuff. I'm a designated pilot examiner and instructor, but we'll handle any aviation questions you want to throw our way. So if you're familiar with my YouTube videos, I tend to stick to the airman certification standards and check ride preparation and talk about systems. So that's what we're going to talk about in these podcasts, but they're a little bit shorter in format and just to add a little bit of interaction throughout the weeks between me being able to sit down and do a longer podcast. So if you're hearing this for the first time and didn't know we had a Discord channel, go to our website, vsl.aero. You can learn how to join that Discord server. And we'll continue that interaction, day to day. I'm on the server every day, interacting with the followers there. I think we got about 250 people on the server now, so it's pretty exciting. Appreciate it. Okay, so let's get started. This week, I picked the topic based on a post that was made by a DPE that I really respect and follow. He's a very prolific writer in all things examination. His name's Jason Blair, and Jason has a great blog. It's jasonblair.net. You can find his blog there, and he talks about all sorts of different topics. Just a wealth of knowledge. I've been reading his blog long before I was ever an examiner, and I used a lot of that information to help me be a better examiner. So I really appreciate Jason's work. And I noticed this blog. I follow him on Facebook, and he posted a update to the blog of a new article. I think it was just yesterday or February 17th when he posted this. And it's basically about things that he would propose changing in the commercial pilot airman certification standards or pilot certification standards and experience requirements, those changes that he would make to that. And I think it was such a good write-up, and it echoes my thoughts almost exactly. So I would like to talk about this too, to help give Jason more of an outreach platform, if you will, and maybe bring this up where we're discussing it more, because I think it's, podcasts like this and blogs like Jason's and social media posts, this is how we can actually help change things, right? That gets it into the discourse. And then when we have these working groups where we talk about changing different parts of the FAR or the ACS, that this is in kind of the common knowledge. We can start bringing it up. So let's talk about some of the things Jason and myself would like to change. And I'm going to go through all of these. We're going to talk about one or two more topics, and then I'm going to open it up for discussion for those of us, or those of the followers that are with us on Discord. So the first one is fix the power off 180. That's the first one. And I thought that was interesting that he chose that as the first topic. So the power off 180, this is a maneuver that you only do starting in the commercial training. So if you're a private pilot training or you're training for your instrument, you may not have done the power off 180. You may have done something similar, and that's where an instructor will simulate a failed engine in the pattern, and you have to execute a safe landing from maybe the downwind. Well, the power off 180 is very similar to that, but with an important caveat of it has a specified aim point. So you have to pick that specified aim point, and you have to hit that aim point minus 0 feet plus 200 feet. That's the objective criteria for hitting that aim point. And recently, the FAA changed the ACS to explicitly say that you cannot go around on that maneuver unless it's for safety of flight. So in other words, if your technique is poor and you're going to land short, if you go around, then that would result in an automatic disapproval. Now you could choose to land, but if you land short, that would be, more than -0 short, so then that would be a disapproval as well. So they're putting the applicant in a position where they're basically they're between a rock and a hard place, right? And one of the important things that Jason brings up is what this is doing is in the training environment we have, and also the check rides, I've experienced this firsthand. Applicants know that if they go around, they're going to get a disapproval. If they land short, they're going to get a disapproval. So they do their best, but maybe the wind changes slightly. Maybe the performance of the plane is slightly different than it was when they were practicing. And when trying to hit that point, the plane isn't quite done flying yet, and they really want to get it on the ground, so they just push the nose over just a little bit to force that plane on the ground. Now, this causes porpoising often, right? When the plane's not done flying, when there's still lift left in the wings, so to speak, and you try to force the airplane on the ground, it's going to start to porpoise because the nose wheel is going to hit first, or you're going to have a firm kind of 3-point, and that nose wheel is going to bounce, and there's still lift in the wings, and you're in ground effect now, so you've got even more lift because of that ground effect, kind of that floating effect. So you bounce back up into the air. We already have forward pressure, so we start this porpoise. And I have issued a couple of disapprovals because it was forced on the ground, and we had several bounces trying to force this maneuver to work. And then the opposite side of that is if you're too short of the point, it's basically teaching or training or conditioning a pilot to try to stretch the glide and keep pulling back. Now you're getting well below stall speed, and you're kind of floating there in ground effect. And if you're above ground effect, or if you balloon out of ground effect, now you're in a position where you're going to have all the lift out of the wings significantly above the runway, and you're going to have a hard landing, or potentially even drop a wing because you're actually in a stall at that point. Maybe lose control on landing, or have a hard landing, damage the airplane. So Jason's point is because of the way that we're treating this maneuver, we're damaging airplanes and potentially people, right? We could have an accident that's caused by us training for this standard. And also the Power Off 180, there's a little bit of confusion here because in the Airplane Flying Handbook, Chapter 9, that's where it talks about the Power Off 180. And also in the Airman Certification Standards, the ACS for commercial, it's also talked about in the takeoff and landing section. But the fact that you can't go around, the reasoning for that is that it's a simulated emergency maneuver, although it doesn't lie within the emergency section of either the Airplane Flying Handbook or the Airman Certification Standards. So which is it? Is it a accuracy and performance maneuver, or is it an emergency maneuver? I think it's probably a little bit of both, but more of an emergency maneuver. And so personally, here's kind of what I would add to what Jason is saying, is we need to be able to accurately land the airplane on a specified point in an emergency situation. The reason is, let's say that I'm flying along at 4,000 feet in the training area or on a cross country somewhere, and I lose an engine and I have a very small field that's maybe the only place that looks suitable for me to try to do a forced landing. Now, the speed at which and the point at which I land on that field, because it is very short, is really important. If I land halfway down that field, by the time I reach the end of that field, whether it's a fence line or trees or a ditch or a cliff or whatever at the end, probably some obstruction that's going to stop the airplane quickly. My life and my passenger lives depend on the speed at which I reach that sudden stopping point, right? So how much energy can I dissipate from where I touch down to where I reach a stopping point? I want to stretch that stop out over as much ground as possible. So that means I want to land at the very front end, the earliest that I can land on that field. That way I've got the whole field to hopefully slow down, dissipate energy, so I don't reach a sudden stop that overpowers my seat belts, maybe causes injury or death. So being able to hit that specified point is really important, because if I don't manage my energy well and I float all the way down that field and I touch down, even though I'm at a slow airspeed, now I'm touching down in those trees or in that fence or whatever that's going to stop the airplane suddenly and cause injury or death. So that's the important skill that we want to manage here. But we have to walk a fine line anytime we're training of how realistic do we want to make the training and how safe do we want to make the training. Usually those are kind of competing things, right? If we make training super realistic, it becomes unsafe. And if we make the training very, very safe, it's not realistic enough, right? And so, for instance, if we wanted to make multi-engine training really realistic, I would pull an engine right as you rotate, right? If we're taking off in a light twin, and I reach over and pull the engine right as we rotate. That's the worst possible time to lose an engine. The reason we don't do that in training or a check ride is that's incredibly dangerous, right? I mean, it is really realistic, but it's also really dangerous, and we would be breaking a lot of airplanes, maybe killing people in training if we did that. So we put kind of some compromises in our training program in the ACS about where we have that engine failure occur to increase safety. So I think that's where we're at with this Power Off 180. We need a common sense approach to it that makes it a safe maneuver where we're not damaging an airplane. And then we also don't want to inadvertently create bad habits of trying to stretch the glide to reach this arbitrary point. We want to manage, a common sense of just managing energy. So what Jason recommends, and I'll just read his proposition here, is he says, I propose the Power Off 180 be conducted with a simulated engine failure abeam the approach end of the runway, and that the applicant be able to touch down in the first third of the runway, or no longer than 1,000 feet down the runway, whichever is shorter. So this basically increases the margin that you have. You've got 1,000 feet to put the plane down, and then bring it to a simulated, basically a short stop. And so what this would prevent is you arbitrarily forcing the airplane down before it's done flying, and it would avoid, give you enough margin where you're not conditioned to maybe extend the glide, thinking that you can do that safely to make the landing point. So I think this is a pretty clear standard. You could argue, and I think it would be correct, that it does make the maneuver a little bit easier, and I don't see a real problem with that. I would rather you get a lot of these reps in and be very competent at putting it down on the first third of the runway than have it be a high-stress maneuver where you're forcing it down and damaging the airplane and really just creating some bad habits in the process. So I really think this is a good idea. I really don't like the fact that we're teaching a landing task and then saying that we're going to disapprove you if you do a go-around. To me, go-arounds are kind of sacrosanct. Like, we should never put an applicant or a student or a pilot in a position where go-arounds are prohibited. I just really don't like that. We can have the discussion later about, hey, there's instances as maybe some bush flying or flying into really challenging airports where go-arounds, you could argue, aren't an option. That's a different argument. We're talking about training basic pilots on our standard airports in the U.S. And in general, go-arounds are always an option, right? And the fact that a pilot doesn't do a go-around is more likely to cause a bad outcome than a pilot that chooses to do a go-around. So that's my thoughts on that. Next, don't do 8s on pylons, do turns on a point. So the 8s on pylons, Jason kind of has a discussion about where the origination of 8s on pylons came from. I won't get into that. It is important to know where that came from. He does a good job kind of talking about maybe, aerial gunning and, old flying in the 1920s and 30s where this was needed. It's no longer needed really now, the specific thing that we're training, but it does test an important skill, and that's being able to divide your attention between the inside of the cockpit, flying the airplane, and an outside object that maybe you're taking a picture of, like for aerial photography purposes. So the 8's on pylons is a really good maneuver because it forces you to look outside. It's one of the few maneuvers that you really can't do unless you're looking outside. I do my best when I'm giving a check ride to kind of look over and, I want to keep my eyes on the instruments and make sure you're holding standards, but also want to pay attention to where the applicant's looking. And on a lot of tasks, they could be spending a lot of their time looking at the instruments and not enough time looking outside, and it'd really be hard for me to catch that 100% of the time. But on the 8's on pylons, it's very, very obvious if you're looking at the instruments because you flat out can't do the maneuver unless you're looking outside the whole time. And now I'm looking at the instrument seeing, hey, are you maintaining the bank angle? Are you keeping the airplane coordinated? A common one is you're using your rudder to cheat to try to bring that wing in line with your point. Again, the 8's on pylons is a commercial only maneuver. We don't do that, or commercial and CFI. We don't do it in private or instrument. So if you have no idea what the 8's on pylons are, you can check out the Commercial Pilot Airman Certification Standards. And what we're doing is it's sort of like a figure eight on the ground, but we're trying to keep an object on a fixed point. Some personal problems I have with this testing is there's no common way of teaching it, and the way that the Airplane Flying Handbook talks about it is a little vague. And so what I see is a lot of flight schools, a lot of flight instructors teach to find a single pylon. They do a pylon turn around it, and then the next pylon they pick out halfway through the maneuver. So in other words, they don't pick out both pylons before beginning the maneuver. Now, one of the common errors is picking two pylons that are too close to one another or too far apart. So I think you should be picking both pylons out to begin with, right? That's not specifically called out in the Airman Certification Standards or in the Airplane Flying Handbook. I think you have to kind of read between the lines, but that's really neither here nor there. The problem is, and what I think Jason brings up accurately, is there's really no real world implication where I would be doing a figure eight pattern around a fixed point. Now there is a real world application, especially as a commercial pilot, why I would want to do a turn around a single fixed point, specifically for an aerial photography mission. Maybe some wildlife management if I'm working for the Department of Interior or Department of Agriculture or something like that. These are all actual missions that a commercial pilot might have. Really, none of those would be flying a figure eight. It would be, hey, there's that one point. And so what Jason proposes is to drop 8's on pylons and replace it with turns on a point with 3 circles being flown while keeping the reference point in either direction. And so I think it would test the same skill. It would get rid of that ambiguity that we have of where the pylons are located. The skill of picking a pylon, I find that hard to justify, of like, why would a pilot need to know that? I've been a pilot for 20 years now. I've flown Part 135 and 91 and military and 121, and really me being able to pick out 2 pylons has never been part of a successful mission that I've flown. Now, I'm not saying I've flown every single mission that's out there. There's always exceptions. But for the most part, the only reason I know how to pick out these pylons is because I give this test all the time, and I grade people on their ability to find the pylons. I find it, even though that I test this, I find it hard to give a valid reason of why that's an important skill to have. But having the skill of looking outside and controlling the airplane's basically all 3 axes of the aircraft while flying around a fixed point, that is a good skill, right? That guarantees you're going to be looking outside still. We don't have to worry about the 8's thing. And I think it's a better test. Another thing that I don't think Jason brought up, but I would, it's a problem that I have, is when doing this maneuver and picking out pylons, the applicant will often get fixated on finding the 2 pylons, and they fail to really scan the area very well, right? And when we go into the maneuver, we're spending part of the maneuver belly up to where we're fixing to turn to. Now, because of pivotal altitudes and how those work, we're generally doing this around 800 to 1,000 feet at a pretty low level. And so we're going belly up and turning in a direction that we haven't cleared recently, right? Normally we want to make a good clearing turn before we operate in that area. Well, we've been turning the other way this whole time. And now we're turning the opposite way. So and if you've picked that pylon out poorly, now you're fixated on the pylon and you don't see what you're actually flying at, and you could easily fly into an obstacle, specifically these antenna with guidelines that comes down in the central US. We've got some really tall antenna, and kind of a fear that I have is that both me and the applicant get caught up in doing this maneuver and picking out our pylons, and we get too fixated on the area where our pylons are, and we're not looking outside enough, and we wind up inadvertently either getting too close or God forbid, actually hitting some sort of obstacle. So I don't, again, that danger is caused by this arbitrary thing of picking 2 points. I don't know. I think there's an argument that it would make the maneuver slightly easier, but I also think that there's an argument that this would test the same things. It would do it in a safer manner, and it would be more objective on how we test this. Okay, next he moves to the steep spiraling descent. He says it's not an emergency landing. And he runs into issues here. I haven't actually run into this specifically, but he states that he knows of a DPE that basically combines this maneuver, the steep spiraling descent, with an emergency landing task. And this kind of brings up a whole different thing where I just had my DPE recurrent training recently. And in that, our standardization branch from the FAA has a discussion on items that we can combine with, or tasks that we can combine. So there's some tasks that we can combine, and there's some tasks that we cannot combine. Those aren't explicitly called out in the ACS, so we have to kind of use our judgment as an examiner. For example, if we are doing slow flight, the FAA wants us to recover from that slow flight maneuver into normal flight. If we combine slow flight with a power off stall, that's not a good thing. That they don't want us to do that in the test. One that we could combine, we could do a forward slip. If we wanted to combine a forward slip to land, which is required in the private pilot, with an actual landing task, then that's fine. We can combine those two normally. Now on the spiraling descent, the specific maneuver called out in the ACS says that the maneuver, we're going to complete the maneuver no lower than 1,500 feet above the ground, above AGL, above ground level. So if you're combining the steep spiral and then having the applicant do an emergency landing or power off landing, then you're obviously not recovering at 1,500 feet, so you're not meeting the intent of the steep spiral, and then you're not really doing the maneuver correctly. So that would be an illegal way to do that maneuver. Now, I don't know how everybody else in the audience or anybody listening to this is, but I've definitely heard of this happening in the training environment, where you're doing a steep spiral and you just continue that steep spiral to an emergency landing. So combining those tasks is not okay. We shouldn't be doing that. One is a steep spiral descent, not an emergency landing. Now, in most cases, there's no need to do a real steep kind of spiraling descent during an emergency. Maybe if there's some sort of uncontained fire and you want to get on the ground quickly, sure, that's a need for an emergency descent. But if I were just out there flying and had some sort of abnormal thing happen with my engine, well, I'm going to point the airplane to the best landing spot, and I'm going to minimize my sink rate, go to best glide, I'm not going to try to get down quickly. Quite the opposite. I'm going to try to stay aloft and keep as much altitude below me as I safely can. That allows me to analyze the situation a lot longer, maybe make some radio calls, maybe do some diagnosing to try to recover whatever went wrong, further analyze my landing zone. If I am doing some sort of spiral down over that, I'm definitely not going to be doing a steep spiral. I'm going to be doing a nice gentle spiral, and that's not going to be in line with the steep spiral maneuver. So basically, we don't need to combine these two. Jason says, I propose it's time we stop teaching the steep spiral as a method to descend quickly to an emergency landing. Teach it just as a method to descend over a point in a stable configuration and return to stable normal flight at the end. Time to take that second sentence out of the airplane flying handbook. So on to the new maneuver. I thought this was really interesting. And I honestly have never thought of this. But Jason proposes adding a new maneuver because, well, I'll just get into the maneuver. It's flying a grid pattern. So he states that, we haven't added a commercial maneuver in a very long time. That's right. We really haven't. It's been kind of standard for a couple decades. And we don't necessarily want to add on to the burden of training a pilot. That already takes a long time, right? But I think it is practical of this grid pattern because flying a grid pattern is something reasonable for a new commercial pilot to do, especially low-time commercial flying jobs often have either a search and rescue grid pattern or some sort of aerial survey or mapping or agriculture. Those are all, especially the mapping and survey, that seems to be more and more common where we have these kind of advanced sensor platforms that you can slap onto a cheap to operate airplane and have a new commercial pilot go fly a grid pattern to map something. So Jason proposes a grid pattern at 3,000 feet AGL be added to the commercial pilot airplane single multi-engine ACS. So that's interesting, add it to both the single and multi, where the pilot would fly 5 lines, returning in the direction of the flight they started, approximately 1 mile in length with a half mile in between lines, showing that they can sequence the lines, make the lines perpendicular to the wind to show the pilot can adjust for wind drift, and then maintain an airspeed plus or minus 10 knots and altitude plus or minus 100 feet. So I think this is really good. It's going to force you to learn how to correct for winds properly, analyze those turns. It's going to require some pre-flight planning on where you're going to do this, using those ground reference points. I think this is a really good maneuver to add. All right, now we're on to some Part 61 stuff. Those are all the maneuvers, and this is to the experience. This is a question that gets asked a lot, and I may have covered it on previous podcasts, but specifically it's 61-129, where it talks about the instrument training. So here's the conundrum. You're an instrument-rated pilot, and you're going to take your commercial check ride, and that's the normal sequence, right? A pilot normally gets their private, then they get their instrument, and then go get their commercial. Well, 61-129 requires that you get 10 hours of instrument training. Now, there's a couple of legal interpretations that talk about this, but just because you hold an instrument rating doesn't mean that you have the right 10 hours of instrument training. Now, this is actually a holdover from when a lot of commercial pilots got their commercial rating without getting their instrument rating. So in that case, it makes perfect sense, right? If you're going from private to commercial and don't have an instrument rating, yeah, you need 10 hours of instrument training before you get that commercial. However, I would say the 99% of pilots nowadays get their instrument first and then get their commercial. So in that case, you've already gotten 10 hours, you've gotten more than 10 hours of instrument training. So I don't know that the additional 10 hours makes a lot of sense. The legal interpretations say that you can count 10 hours that you did as an instrument pilot for that 10 hours for a commercial if it was logged correctly. But the FARs don't say what specifically you have to do to make it correct when you log it. What I recommend is people write IAW, which stands for in accordance with, 61-129 for all of their instrument training they receive as an instrument pilot from a CFII. And that, to me, would be logged correctly, so an examiner would say, yes, that those 10 hours do count towards your commercial rating. So it doesn't specifically say that. So what Jason recommends we change 61-129 A3 and B3 to is to simply add the words or be the holder of an instrument rating. So that would remove that arbitrary requirement to log correctly and write in IAW 61-129 on all your instrument training before you've even started your commercial training. It would just fix a lot of the problems with that. And I think this is straightforward. It's not making anything easier. It's just making it more clear. And I think a lot more practical. So totally agree with that one. The next one is in line with this, the 61-129 A3I and B3I. They specifically talk about, this is the instrument training still, the 10 hours, is the 10 hours of instrument training has to be done with a view limiting device. And this is in current rules. So as of right now, let's see, let me make sure I'm quoting this correctly. Yeah, it's specific. 61-129 specifically says that the instrument training for the commercial has to be done using a view limiting device, which implies that if you do it in actual IMC conditions, that doesn't count. So remember the instrument training you did in accordance with 61-129 during your instrument training for your instrument rating. I think I'm probably losing some people in the mud here. I'm sorry. I'll try to clarify it up. But you're private. Now you've moved on to your instrument. While you're doing that instrument training, and remember you need at least 15 hours with a CFII. So those 15 hours that CFII is making a notation in your logbook, IAW 61-129, and then they might write in all the other, accomplishments or items that you did on that flight. And that lets future know when you start your commercial next month that training was done in accordance with the commercial rating, and that's going to carry forward to your commercial check ride and make sure it qualifies for that. Well, let's say some of those 15 hours that you get during your instrument rating were done during IMC conditions without the use of a view limiting device, because if you're in actual conditions, you don't need a view limiting device. Well, the way the regs currently read, that's not allowed. It has to be with a view limiting device. So Jason just recommends that we change it to read 10 hours of instrument training in actual or simulated IFR conditions to remedy this limitation. So again, I think this makes total sense as well. All right, the last one, and then we'll go into our next topic and then open up for questions. So not much longer. The next one's talk about, again, the commercial rating, 61-129. And this is talking about the, there's a lot of different names for this, PICUS or DPIC, basically duties performing pilot or performing duties of piloting command. Supervised solo is probably the most common word here. So 61-129 A4 and B4 says that 10 hours of solo time must be solo or DPIC, so that's supervised solo. So it can't be a mixture of the two. It can only be either or. This creates a lot of confusion because maybe somebody goes out and they do their long cross country, let's say for their commercial, they do that solo. But then they do their nighttime, instead of solo, they do that with a supervising instructor performing duties of piloting command. They can't use those times together. It has to be all or nothing. It has to be all solo time or it has to be all supervised solo time. It can't be a mixture of the two. So what winds up happening, this has happened again to a couple check rides where I show up for the check ride, the applicant thinks that they're qualified, but after looking at their logbook, it's pretty clear that they've mixed these two. And thou shalt not do that under the current regulations. So Jason's proposition here is we change 14 CFR 61-129A4 and B4 to read 10 hours of solo flight in a single or multi-engine airplane, or 10 hours flight time performing the duties of pilot and command in a single multi-engine airplane with an authorized instructor on board who is not providing instruction during the flight or any combination thereof, either of which may be accredited towards the flight time requirements under paragraph A. So it's any combination. I would take this a step further, and it's not that I disagree with Jason, he just didn't bring this up, is I don't really like having the supervised solo as an option for single engine aircraft. I think that's something that should just be allowed in multis. I think it used to just be allowed in multis, and it was really because of the insurance wasn't going to insure a solo multi-engine, wet behind the ears pilot in training to go out and solo the multi. So in that case, they need a supervising instructor who's not instructing, they're just there to make sure you don't damage the airplane or hurt yourself. In a single engine, that insurance caveat isn't a problem because we've already done solo for a private. And all this does, I think, is maybe hamstrings our pilots a little bit from, it takes the pressure off of them having to be the pilot in command, because they're like, yeah, I am the pilot in command on paper, but I've got this instructor who's right next to me that's going to save me if anything really bad happens. And just having that as kind of a safety net there maybe takes a little bit of the pressure off. And I don't know that that's a good thing. I think it's better to get as much solo time, do that all in real solo conditions. I think solo time is important. I talked about this on another podcast and it may sound like I'm talking out of both sides of my mouth, where I said, I don't think a lot of solo time is required to be a good pilot. But I do think, I'm not talking about a lot, I'm just talking about what's required for the commercial. So if you do what's required for the commercial and private pilot, we're still only talking, around 15, 20 hours of solo time. That's not that much solo time. So I think that would be good to just remove the single engine option altogether and just leave it as a multi. I'm not sure why the decision was made to allow it for singles, but here we are. All right, so those are Jason's topics to bring up. I'd love to hear what people have to say about that. One other topic that I'm going to bring up, and this got brought up in the Discord just yesterday, in fact. And it's been brought up several times. But the basic gist of the question is airplanes are expensive to rent. If you're renting from a school, there's a lot of other people at that school, and they want to rent the same airplanes, and so now you're waiting, and you feel like you're being delayed because the airplanes aren't available. And you look at Barnstormers or Trade a Plane, and you see a plane out there, and you're thinking, well, wow, I need to build all these hours, and then I'm eventually going to become a CFI and start teaching. So why don't I just buy an airplane? I'll get my ratings in my own airplane, and then I'll turn around and become an instructor, and I'll start teaching in my own airplane. And that seems like a pretty good financial move, right? Because now I'm the one that has this asset. I don't have to wait on other people. I can use the plane whenever I want, and then I can turn around and potentially make a little bit of a profit, or at the very least offset my cost of that airplane. So as a rule, I generally say it's not a good idea to do that. I don't encourage people to go out and buy airplanes to build their time, especially if they're not even a private pilot yet. Even if they have their commercial rating and they're working on their CFI, owning and operating an airplane safely and keeping it maintained, it's a really big responsibility. It's also a really big financial responsibility, and it takes a lot of finances. Generally, it doesn't work out for people, and I've seen this happen time and time again. At the one end of the spectrum, I see people that are really successful, and we'll actually have one of my friends, his name's Ben, a great friend of mine, flying for NetJets now. He did this. He bought an old Cessna 120, and he built a lot of his hours in that Cessna 120. He didn't build all of his hours in it, though. But he built a lot of hours in that airplane, turned around and sold it, and I think, made out pretty well. It worked out really well for him. But for every case where it worked out well for somebody, I know of 2 or 3 cases where they bought the airplane, they had a great time flying it for 40 or 50 hours, and then it needed a new engine. Well, let's say they paid $30,000 for this kind of older, affordable airplane, not knowing that it was going to need a new engine soon, and now it needs a new engine, which is going to be about $30,000. So now you just doubled your investment of the airplane. If you want to keep it flying, you have to fork over another 30 grand. And then while it's getting that engine, it's going to be down for months. So you're not going to be flying during that period, or you're going to have to go out and rent from the place that you didn't want to rent from to begin with to supplement for your plane that's in the shop. So I just can't stress enough how quickly a plane can turn into something affordable that you love, and you just love the fact that you have it, to something that is incredibly expensive and that you're basically struggling to make ends meet now, trying to finance this big hole that you're just throwing money into. So it's a huge responsibility to take on as a new pilot, and there's too often it just doesn't work out that well. Overall, buying an airplane isn't like a great money-making endeavor. But if you want to own an airplane, then buy an airplane. But kind of do your homework. If I can't talk you out of it, that's fine. But do your homework and make sure that you have an out. Make sure that you have a good fund built up. Make sure that you do good pre-buy. If you spend money to buy the airplane, spending money on a good pre-purchase inspection, making sure that you have a good mechanic, making sure that you have at least a covered hangar, would be great. That would really decrease your maintenance costs. There's a lot of things you need to think about, and just, as a rough estimate, I would expect to spend around $10,000 a year before you fly it at all. You're going to be investing about $10,000 a year. So if that doesn't sound like anything that's even close to your budget, I would not suggest it. So that's my thoughts on that. I've talked for way too long, and we've got, 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12. We've got about 15 people in the audience. So John, if you want to open it up for people. All right, Connor, what's up?
Just wanted to ask 2 questions, kind of going back a little bit to what you said about the commercial pilot airman certification standards. We were talking about, I believe it was the Power Off 180, and you mentioned the go around as a tool, right? That could possibly be looked at in terms of the maneuver. Do you think that if the go around was added to the maneuver, then we could kind of keep the same maneuver, or would you like, to see both of these things happen, making it the first start of the runway, not so much more of an emphasis on the emergency and less on the accuracy? And if they added a go around to this maneuver, it would now you're kind of looking at more of a strictly landing maneuver, because you can't really go around in an emergency. So do you think if they added a go around, it'd be acceptable to keep the current standards?
Yeah, I've thought about that too, of like allowing one go around, up to one go around, and leave the standards of the same as they are now, but allow up to one kind of mulligan, if you will. I don't know. I could see it going either way. The way Jason proposed it, I think, again, keeps it within, I think that's a useful skill. We're testing something good. You're going to learn how to do the skill really well. I think allowing just the one go around doesn't solve the problem of people forcing the plane on the ground or trying to extend the glide, which is kind of his main or one of his main concerns, is the fact that we're breaking airplanes practicing the maneuver as is.
And I agree. And I wanted to chime in. And one other thing, putting everything else in the article aside, I wanted to also mention, I think that something that should be added to the commercial ACS is more of an emphasis on emergencies. There's really no change from private in terms of this. And I think as a commercial pilot, of course you can kind of throw in more of a pressurization scenario or something that's more applicable to a commercial ACS. But I think for the CFI check ride, it says, or when it was an old PTS at least, it used to say you have to pick 5 equipment malfunctions. I think something similar should be required for commercial, because, commercial pilots, I feel like, a lot of people make the joke that they get paid to fix when automation fails or an error occurs. So I think that if you're going for your commercial rating, which obviously a lot of people don't use it to go right to commercial operations, but for the sole purpose of calling it a commercial check ride, I think that there should be more of an emphasis on emergencies. And I know a lot of people just do the engine failure or engine fire. I mean, you could pick from a several amount of things, but I definitely think if you added more emergencies that had to be done, like 4 or 5 of them, uh, that would be very beneficial, especially in this day and age where we're seeing an uptick in accidents and so on.
Yeah, adding them, adding 4 or 5 emergencies. So I get what you're saying. Yeah, there needs to be an emphasis on emergencies in commercial training. But now we're maybe getting out of what needs to be added to the ACS versus what needs to be taught. And I think emergencies are already emphasized as far as being things that you need to teach as a CFI. And there's a pretty big gap between what everything you're teaching as a instructor to a new commercial student to what's being tested on the check ride. Obviously, with the time constraints of the check ride, unless we want to make the check ride a multi-day event, which I don't think anybody's advocating that we make the check ride, significantly longer. We, what you're talking about is really a training problem. Those instructors need to be teaching all different types of emergencies in that scenario-based training kind of format that the FIT syllabus kind of all talked about. So that's really important as an instructor to do that. Mandating that emergency be taught on the check ride, yeah, of course. I do simulated emergency on all my check rides, and it's kind of in line with the overall scenario of the flight that we're doing. That's kind of up to the examiner on what they're going to do. If they're just going to do an engine failure, then that's one thing. I prefer to do some sort of, instrument failure, like you don't have an airspeed indicator, or maybe you've got some sort of communications failure. I might verbally, in the ground, or maybe the pre-flight, talk about, well, what would you do if this component fails and we were in the air? How would you handle that? There's several different ways to evaluate that. But adding that to the check ride, we could do that, but that would, increase the complexity and difficulty of the check ride. But yeah, it's definitely something that needs to be happening in the training.
All right, Seth. So this was a scenario that happened to me. Basically, somebody had to fly down to the state of Texas for a court appearance. The state required that he appear in person, and he has a sort of fear of flying on an airline. And so he wanted basically to hire a commercial pilot, a friend of his, to fly him down. But neither of them had a plane. So, that person's, the commercial pilot also happens to be an instructor. And so, when you're in that scenario as that instructor, do you have any advice for how they could potentially go get a plane at a school or, from somebody else or something like that, without the instructor then obtaining operational control in that scenario?
Yeah, this is a complicated scenario, and I've never really heard of anything like this or thought about it. Well, the closest I've thought about it is the Department of Defense has a defense travel system, a DTS system, and one of the options in there is you're flying by personal plane. And if you file a voucher, so let's say the Air Force tells me to go work somewhere, I can go do that work and I can come back and I can choose to fly my own airplane, and I file this voucher, and the Air Force will reimburse me at a certain rate. And I believe at one point it was like $1.50 a mile or something like that. They'll reimburse me for that trip. So in that case, I'm in operational control, right? I'm making the decision to fly there. I'm paying for all the fuel, and I'm not carrying anyone with me or carrying any cargo. So I think that falls in the line. Now, your question is, now you've got this state entity that's kind of going to do the same thing. They're going to, in theory, either reimburse you, or they're going to give your friend the money, who's then going to pay you. And is your friend going to be in operational control? Are you going to be in operational control, or is the state going to be in operational control? I don't see a way where the state would be acting in operational control. I just don't see that happening. I think you would be, at the end of the day, either you would be in operational control or your friend would be in operational control. And obviously, if you are providing yourself, the pilot and the plane, and you're flying a passenger for A to B for compensation, then that's an activity that needs to be under a certificate. So unless you had a 135, I don't think you could do that. If your friend is paying for everything and he sourced the airplane from this flight school or a place that you can rent airplanes from, and then he's obviously your friend, he's going to pay you as a commercial pilot to fly him there, then yeah, I could see that being, you're just offering pilot services at that point. Your friend is acting as operational control. I would be very careful there, though, because, is he a legitimate operator? And that's that squishy thing that's kind of hard to define, is does he know what it takes to be in operational control of the airplane? Probably not. So he's probably outsourcing a lot of that to you and trusting you, at which point you're kind of assuming some operational control, and then you get into that sticky area where now you're kind of in operational control again, and now this is turning into a charter situation. So
I will say that the FAA does have a really nice brochure on operational control. And one of the things that I thought was really interesting about it was that they sort of specifically mentioned that scenario where the operator, quote unquote, is somebody who has no piloting experience or knowledge. And they said in that brochure that the operator then is deferring to the pilot's professional experience and judgment to make those decisions. And in that process, they are not necessarily giving up operational control, which I thought was interesting. So it sounds like, if you're a rich business person, you're hiring a professional team of pilots, you're not giving up operational control. You're just letting them use their professional judgment to make those decisions. So
yeah, and I agree. The key difference in your scenario and the scenario that you just described is that the operator, the rich person that buys the airplane, is maintaining a really important component of operational control, and that's actual ownership. So if they are owning that asset, either through the aircraft registration or some sort of lease agreement, and again, if you're going to lease an airplane, the FAA has a lease example in the advisory circular, Truth in Leasing. I forget the actual number of that advisory circular, but that Truth in Leasing document has an example lease, but that lease agreement is basically transferring ownership to you. So I either own the airplane outright or I'm leasing it through that. Then that's a really important operational control, and I can kind of outsource the rest of the OpCon, right, to my pilot or somebody that manages pilots, right? And I'm trusting them to do that. So in your case, and this is a gray area, guys. I'm not going to lie. This is a very gray area of your friend who has never had anything to do with aviation. He's never owned an airplane. He just kind of walked into this flight. Like, that component of it, is he really exercising that ownership component and then outsourcing it to you as a pilot? Or does it look like you're basically doing everything and you're just providing him with transportation? So I think that's the big differentiator there, is somebody that actually owns the aircraft, Roman said, I've done the private plane option in DTS. It wasn't too complicated. Yeah, Roman, I've done that too. I did the private plane option a couple of times. And it was kind of interesting, is I didn't think about it a lot at the time, but now, thinking about it from the other side of the thing of, that could easily be an illegal charter that DTS is helping you do. So it's like one arm of the government doesn't really understand the regulations from the other side of the government. Because if you would have done that DTS voucher and you brought people with you, now you're transporting people and you're in operation. So that could be a violation of the FARs. that's funded by the government. So the government could be paying you to break the law. It's kind of interesting concept. Of course, that'd be inadvertent, and they're trusting you to know that as a pilot. So row, okay. Hey Seth, I'm currently training for my instrument rating and was wondering if you're going to open up any check ride times in the next few months. I will do my best. Watch my calendar on the website. There's probably people watching that don't know, so I'll just say I have kind of 3 jobs. I do the VSL thing, which is check rides, the ACE guide, and content. So that's one component, and then the other component is in the Air Force Reserves. I'm aircraft commander and instructor in the C-130, and the Air Force Reserves is just kind of the part-time Air Force deal. So I do that some days of the month, and then my 3rd job is a first officer at Southwest Airlines. So I fly a couple of trips with Southwest, so I stay pretty busy. And then trying to balance all that is really difficult. During the winter time, I don't do a lot of check rides because the weather's just typically not that conducive to that. So my kind of check ride season starts up maybe later March, April, and then goes in through, around November. But December, January, and February, traditionally, I don't do a lot of check rides. So in that time, there's still people training, and it kind of builds up this big backlog that I'll start whittling away at.
Somebody on Instagram asked if you had any light bulb moments when learning or instructing instrument training.
Light bulb moments. Maybe on the teaching side, this is something that I really like to teach in instrument training is to fix large. So either you're teaching and you're having a student that's having problems with large corrections or too large of a correction, or you're an instrument pilot and you're having that problem. And an indication of that is, I love recording your GPS trail or looking at your ADS-B trail. If you see that S turning on final for an ILS, that's a classic example of you're making too large of corrections. And that's a pilot-induced oscillation most of the time. A good fix for that is if you're slightly off course, instead of trying to hold the plane in a turn, I would look at the top of the instrument case. So you have kind of the airplane marking on your attitude indicator, and it has the wing marks on the sides, so you can kind of dip the wings to a 30-degree angle of bank, right? I wouldn't look at that part of the attitude indicator. Look at the very top, and you're going to see 2 arrows. And those 2 arrows, when they're touching one another, you're in 0 degrees of bank. And when I want to make a small correction, what I'll do is I'll turn the attitude indicator where it just kind of kisses that 10-degree mark and then go back level. And so I just kind of do a little bump. So I bump the 10-degree mark and back. And what you'll notice on your heading now, if you kiss that 10-degree and then go back, and you're not doing it super fast, try to do it at a standard rate, nice and gentle, you'll see that you've corrected only about 5 degrees, maybe 2 to 5 degrees. So that's a great objective, aim small, miss small is a way you can think about it. But doing that method will keep you from holding the turn way too long, because that's usually what is happening is you go into a standard rate turn and you hold it for a few seconds. So that's way too much. You just corrected maybe 15 degrees and only needed 5 degrees. So I think taking little bites out of that, using that method, will really cut down on the amount of oscillations that you have trying to track a course. Question came up in the Discord. I'm glad you brought that up, Micah. So Micah's question earlier was you're flying an ILS and you get to minimums and you see, or at any point, you make visual contact with the runway and you see your visual glide slope indicator. Let's say it's PAPIs. So you're flying the ILS down and you see the PAPIs. And let's say the PAPIs say that you're slightly high, but the ILS says that you're right on. Should you continue to follow the ILS, or should you transition to the visual glide slope indicator? And my answer was the visual glide slope indicator takes precedence specifically below minimums. So once you're below minimums, that visual glide slope indicator is guiding you and making sure you're clear of any obstacles at that airport, and that takes precedence. It's funny, I tried to look for a reference where this was in black and white, but I couldn't find it. Maybe somebody out there knows. The closest that I could come is into, or is in Part 91 in regards to a Class Delta airport. If you're in a turbine-powered aircraft that's serviced by a visual glide slope indicator, you must fly at or above that visual glide slope path. You cannot do the duck under or go below glide path there. The visual glide slope is boss there at a Class Delta airport. The other thing that you'll see is if you're flying an instrument approach that isn't coincidental with the visual glide slope, that will be notated on the instrument approach itself. And so there needs to be a little bit of analysis that happens there of, hey, if the glide slope, especially, and this is really important on RNAV approaches, if the RNAV approach, it's always going to be 3 degrees pretty much, unless it says otherwise. But that RNAV approach is bringing you in at 3 degrees to an airport that has a 4-degree glide slope, then it is really important that you level off at minimums to capture the 4 degree, which is a steeper approach, and go into the airport. Because if you don't, you could be getting really close to some terrain that's nearby. And there's 2 airports in Arkansas that actually have this. One is my local airport, Russellville, has an approach to runway 25. That runway 25 has a 4-degree glide slope, and the advisory glide slope that your GPS draws you is 3 degrees. And if you follow that 3 degree, you're going to get within like 50 feet of some trees on a mountain. And if you're slightly low, you're probably going to drag a landing gear or worse through those trees. So you really need to level off at minimums, capture the visual glide slope indicator, and then follow that steeper approach down. So I'm glad you asked that. Long answer, but the short answer long is follow the visual glide slope. All right, Jared. Hi, Seth. Say you're approaching a runway approach area on taxiway. The field is uncontrolled at that time. However, airlines are landing on the runway that the approach area is protecting. When tower is in operation, the tower always says hold short of the approach area for that runway. However, when it is uncontrolled, must we hold short of the approach area if we know the traffic is inbound, or is it a recommendation? The ILS hold short option, I think, is what you're talking about. But you could be talking about an approach hold short, which is kind of, there's 2 different things there. So if it's an approach hold short, then that means there's Long Beach. If you look up the Long Beach airport in California, I was just there, so I know that there's an approach hold short there. There's also one in Fort Lauderdale Executive on the south side of the runway. And that's basically you're on a taxiway, and it looks to be just a random place for a hold short marking. And what it is there's a crossing runway that's approach path is over that taxiway. And if you taxi on that taxiway, then your tail basically, you're going to stick up above the taxiway. And now you could, if the plane coming in on the approach is too low, they could actually hit you. So that's an approach hold short. So he gave me a reference of the GNV 1129 approach area. So let me pull that up to see. The other one is the ILS hold short, and typically I'll have to find the regulation here, but I think the ILS hold short is only required if the ceiling is like below 800 feet. So if you have a ceiling below 800 feet, you need to hold short of any ILS hold short markings. So there is a yeah, thank you, Connor. You said 802, so that's correct. If you are like at Hot Springs Airport in Arkansas, it's a non-towered field. There's the ILS there, and there is a instrument hold short. So obviously, there's no tower there to tell you that ILS hold short markings are in effect. So you have to know, hey, it's ceilings are low. I need to hold short of that ILS if somebody's on final. So let me pull up KGNV. Yeah, I'll just invite him to speak. There we go.
Hey Seth, can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you, Jared.
Yes, sir. So it's actually on the it's on 725 on the runway, and it's also on Alpha and Delta.
Okay.
It's actually in regards to a little situation we had last night. So I work for the Gainesville Regional Airport Authority here as a airport operations guy. I'm also a pilot. Um, After about 22:30ish local time last night, tower closed, and at 22:35 local time, tower called me on the phone, and they're like, "Hey, you got 3 airplanes in the approach area, and there's a CRJ 900 on final for 1-1, and they can't be there." So I was like, "Well, I'm not ATC, and it's an uncontrolled field," so I was like confused at why ATC called me in that particular matter, and if that was actually a violation or not.
Yeah, I think that would be a runway incursion.
Because they were holding short on taxiway Delta, and they were going to be departing runway 7. There was 3 airplanes in there. They were in the approach area.
Yeah, I think that would be considered a runway incursion because they were in that approach area with somebody on final. They were somewhere that they didn't need to be, and that's exactly what I was talking about. Where, if the CRJ is slightly low, and probably less so with a training aircraft, but if you had another CRJ in that area, then they're obviously sticking up 20, 30 feet. That could be a real problem. Yeah, so that would be a good, if you know one of those pilots, if they were with your school, file an ASAP,
Mhm.
and then also talk to the tower there, because this is an odd situation for sure. I can't pull up the aerial imagery for whatever reason to actually see the whole short markings, but that might be worthy of like a hotspot, or it might be worthy of some signage. If you put some signage off to the side that says, hold short here, if
Like,
you hear traffic, on
yes, sir.
final or something like that, there
Yes,
needs
sir.
to be some communication that happens. Yeah. No, that's a great question.
But thank you, Seth. Appreciate it.
Yeah, you bet. I think we've been going long enough. I think I'm gonna hang it up for tonight. Thanks for joining us on the live show, guys. I really appreciate it. Look forward to seeing you next week. We're doing another one of these on Tuesday of next week. So if you're not a member of Discord, you can join us there. You can, looks like you can post questions all over the place wherever we're live streaming. So I appreciate your interaction there. I hope to see y'all in a future podcast. Thank you so much for listening. We'll see you next time.